believe a former WWII concentration camp could become a 5-star luxury resort? That the screams of prisoners could be replaced by the laughter of honeymooners on the same island, in the same walls, under the same sky? Or that an island the world called Hell on Earth, a place where the sick were sent to disappear, to be forgotten, to die, could become one of the most quietly beautiful places in the Mediterranean? This is the Balkans, a peninsula in southeast Europe that most of the world knows only through fragments. A war here, an ancient ruin there, a bridge you've seen in a photograph but couldn't quite place on a map. What most of the world does not know is that these fragments belong to a whole, and that whole is unlike anything else on Earth. Everywhere else in the world, history is behind glass. You visit it, you photograph it, you leave. In the Balkans, history is the present. It is the house you live in, the street you walk down, the scar on the pavement outside your front door. What happens to a people who cannot or will not escape their history? In the next 50 minutes, you will see 3 answers to that question. None of them will be what you expect. First, the Balkans builds beauty on its worst wounds. The most terrible things that happened here have become the most beautiful places, not by pretending they never happened, by refusing to look away. Second, when the world below became too dangerous, too chaotic, too broken, people in the Balkans climbed. They carved footholds into vertical cliffs. They built monasteries where no monastery should stand. And they lived there, generations of them, in a silence that gravity itself seems to respect. Third, in the Balkans, ruins are not ruins. They are addresses. 3,000 people live, work, and sleep inside a Roman emperor's palace right now, not as a museum exhibit, as their actual home. This journey takes about 50 minutes. Stay until the end, because the answer I'm building toward only makes sense once you've seen all 3, and it will change how you look at every place you've ever visited. In the Adriatic Sea, a few kilometers off the coast of Montenegro, there is a small circular island. From above, it looks almost perfect. A ring of ancient stone walls rising straight from turquoise water, open to the sky at the center, surrounded on every side by the kind of blue that makes you want to stop whatever you're doing and simply look. More than 2,000 people passed through Mamula during those years. Many of them did not survive. Testimonies from survivors describe systematic starvation, forced labor, and public executions used to maintain control. The walls that now look beautiful in the afternoon light were, for 2 years, the boundary of a place designed to break human beings. The second story began in 2014, when a developer signed a lease on the island with the Montenegrin government. The vision: a luxury boutique resort, infinity pools, a wellness spa, private boat access. Those same stone walls, the boundary of a place where people were killed, would become the perimeter of an experience that travel magazines would describe as extraordinary and unlike anywhere in the world. Survivors' associations protested, human rights organizations filed objections, international petitions circulated. The argument was not complicated. How can you make a luxury resort out of a concentration camp? How can you sell relaxation and beauty in a place where people were killed? The developer's response was also not uncomplicated. A memorial would be included. The history would be documented and built into the experience. The island would be given new purpose rather than left to decay in the Adriatic sun, its story fading along with its stonework. Both positions contained genuine moral weight. Neither was entirely satisfied. Who decides when a wound has healed? Who has the authority to say, this is no longer a site of suffering, it is now a site of beauty? Is the conversion of a place of horror into a place of joy an act of disrespect, or the most defiant assertion that life continues, that joy has the right to exist where cruelty once stood? The Balkans does not answer that. It holds the question open, the way the stone walls of Mamula hold the sea and the sky and the silence, and it keeps living around it. 200 miles to the south, in the Cretan Sea, there is another island with 2 stories, Spinalonga. From 1903 to 1957, it served as Greece's primary leper colony. Leprosy in the early 20th century was not simply a disease, it was a social verdict. A diagnosis meant removal from your family, from your community, from every ordinary structure of life. You were sent to an island, and told in effect that your life as it had been was over. The patients arrived through a gate in the Venetian walls that locals came to call Dante's Gate, a reference to the entrance of hell in the Inferno, above which the poet wrote, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." The name was not meant as poetry, it was meant as description. What happened inside confounds any simple narrative of tragedy. The people of Spinalonga did not abandon hope. Within years of the colony's establishment, the residents had formed a governing council, created a marketplace, built a working economy. By the 1930s, Spinalonga had shops, a cinema, a cafe, and a weekly newspaper. There were schools, not because anyone told them to build schools. There was no external authority ensuring an education for children whose parents had been declared socially dead. There were schools because the people of Spinalonga understood that children born into this situation would still need to think, to read, to understand the world that had rejected them. The colony maintained its own church, its own priest. Religious services were held every Sunday. Baptisms took place there. Marriages, and funerals, many funerals, the dead buried in the small cemetery at the island's edge, within sight of the Cretan coast that most of them would never reach again. The last resident of Spinalonga, a man named Georgos Pliotas, left the island in 1957. When the colony was officially closed, the remaining patients boarded a boat to the mainland, many returning to a Greece they barely recognized, to communities where they were still feared and avoided even after their disease was cured. In 2005, the British author Victoria Hislop published a novel set partly on Spinalonga. It became an international bestseller, later adapted as a Greek television series. The effect on tourism was significant, but the novel also did something that straightforward historical documentation rarely achieves. It made the lives of the people who lived on Spinalonga feel continuous with the lives of the people reading about them. Not historical curiosities, not cautionary tales. People. What remains on Spinalonga is not what most ruins remind you of. It does not feel like a place of greatness fallen. It feels like a place of ordinary human persistence, the daily business of making meaning in a situation that offered none of the usual materials for meaning-making. And that is a stranger, and in some ways more powerful, kind of monument than any palace or cathedral. On the 5th of April, 1992, the city of Sarajevo woke to the beginning of something that would not end for nearly 4 years. The siege of Sarajevo, 1,425 days, is the longest siege of a capital city in the history of modern warfare. Longer than the siege of Leningrad in World War II, longer than any siege in the conflicts of the 20th century. The city was encircled by forces positioned in the surrounding hills. Snipers targeted people crossing the street. Artillery shells fell on hospitals, on schools, on the central market. Approximately 13,000 people were killed in Sarajevo during those 1,425 days. More than 5,000 of them were civilians going about whatever version of daily life remained possible under siege. When the siege ended in 1996, Sarajevo faced a decision that every city faces after catastrophic violence: what to do with the evidence. The bullet holes were everywhere. The most efficient path was obvious: repair everything, replaster the walls, let the city look as quickly as possible like a city that had not been at war. Sarajevo did not take that path entirely. The bullet holes remained on hundreds of facades across the city, preserved not by neglect but by decision, and in the pavement something even more deliberate was done. The mortar craters, the impact points of shells that had killed civilians on these streets, were filled with red resin, not repaired, not smoothed over, marked. Not every mortar crater was turned into a rose. The original program designated only those craters where 3 or more people had been killed. So walking through Sarajevo, you learn to read the pavement. The roses are a map of the worst moments, and the streets around them, where people are going about their morning, buying coffee, walking children to school, are a statement about what comes after the worst moments. There is another thing about Sarajevo worth noting. During the siege, the city's library, the WWII, completed in 1896, one of the most beautiful buildings in the Balkans, was deliberately targeted and burned by artillery. An estimated 1.5 million books and manuscripts were destroyed. Locals formed human chains in the streets during the shelling to pass books out of the burning building. The WWII has since been restored. The books cannot be restored. A friend who lives in Sarajevo told me something I have thought about since. She said, "We kept the bullet holes because we did not want to be the generation that pretended The generation that comes after us should know, not to be angry, but to understand. There is a difference between not being able to forget and choosing to remember. We chose. The Balkans doesn't erase its wounds. It turns them into part of its face, and in doing so creates a beauty that nowhere else on Earth can replicate, because nowhere else has earned it the same way. That is how the Balkans faces history on the ground. But when the ground itself became unsafe, they climbed, higher than anyone dared to follow.
In the Thessaly region of central Greece, the land breaks in a way that makes no geological sense to the eye. Sandstone columns rise hundreds of meters from the valley floor. Isolated, vertical, impossible looking. They were formed over 60 million years, shaped by earthquakes and erosion into shapes that seem designed rather than natural, as though the earth were preparing a stage for something. In the 14th century, Byzantine monks fleeing Ottoman expansion looked at these pillars and made a decision that is either an act of extraordinary faith or extraordinary desperation, and possibly both. They decided to build on top of them. There was no road to the top. There was no scaffolding technology of the kind we would recognize. The monks used ropes and hand-carved footholds in the rock, pulling themselves and their materials up the sheer faces of these pillars. At its peak in the 16th century, there were 24 monasteries on the Meteora pillars. Today, 6 remain, and they are not museums. They are functioning monastic communities. Monks and nuns live in them. Services are held daily. The ancient rhythms of monastic life continue at 400 meters above the valley floor, as they have continued for 6 centuries. For centuries, the only way to reach the monasteries was by rope net or by ladders that could be pulled up, leaving the inhabitants completely inaccessible to anyone below. Supplies were hauled up in large baskets attached to ropes and pulley systems. The system still exists at some of the monasteries today. You can watch it in operation, the same mechanism, the same patient relationship with gravity that has defined this place for 600 years. During the Second World War, the monasteries served as points of resistance and as hiding places for escaped Allied prisoners of war. The near inaccessibility that was built into the site for spiritual reasons became, in wartime, a tactical advantage. The pillars that had protected the monks from Ottoman soldiers in the 14th century performed the same function in a different war with different soldiers, 6 centuries later. A visitor to Meteora once asked a monk how often the monastery changed its ropes. The monk looked at the ropes, then at the visitor, with an expression that suggested the question had missed something important. Then he said, "Only when God lets it break." There is something clarifying about that answer. It is not recklessness, it is a particular kind of trust that people who live above the world tend to develop. Trust not in the rope itself, but in the process, that what needs to hold will hold, and what is meant to give way will, and that fighting that distinction is the only real source of fear. Standing below Meteora, looking up at the pillars, what strikes you is not the architecture, extraordinary as it is. What strikes you is the decision. At the moment of greatest external threat, when the political order was collapsing and nothing was safe, someone looked at an impassable cliff face and thought, "That is exactly where I will go." The monks did not find a safe place. They created inaccessibility itself and called it home. In Montenegro, a few hundred miles to the northwest, a different monk made a different decision about height. Vasilije of Ostrog, in 1665, chose a vertical cliff face at 900 meters elevation as the location for his monastery. Not near the cliff, in the cliff. The upper monastery at Ostrog is built directly into a naturally occurring cave in the cliff face. The white painted walls are not against the rock, they are the rock. The boundary between human architecture and natural cliff has been deliberately erased. Standing before it, you cannot tell where the mountain ends and the monastery begins, because there is no meaningful difference between those two things anymore. There is no paved road to the upper monastery. There has never been a paved road. There is a stone trail that pilgrims have been walking for 3.5 centuries, up through scrub oak and limestone, past the lower monastery, up to the cave in the cliff. The trail takes most people between 1 and 2 hours. Many pilgrims make the climb barefoot, as an act of devotion. Every year, approximately 1 million pilgrims visit Ostrog, the second most visited Orthodox Christian pilgrimage site in the world. They come from across the Balkans, from Russia, from scattered communities in the diaspora, and notably, many of them are not Orthodox. Many are Catholic, Muslim, or not religious at all. The mountain does not ask for credentials, it simply receives whoever comes. The word we usually use for what humans do to the natural world is impose. We impose structures onto landscapes. We reshape the land to accommodate our purposes. What Ostrog is, and what Meteora is something closer to the opposite. Not an imposition, but a negotiation. The cliff agreed to hold the monastery. Gravity, for reasons of its own, decided to cooperate. On the island of Amorgos, in the Aegean Sea, a monastery called Panaya Hosovoyotissa has been pressed against a vertical cliff face since the year 1017. From a boat approaching the island from the east, you see the cliff first, a vertical face of grey stone dropping straight into the sea. Then, as you come closer, you begin to see what is attached to it. The building is 8 stories tall and barely 12 meters wide. It does not sit on a ledge, it adheres, plastered against the vertical rock as though gravity had been convinced, or overruled, or simply ignored. There is one entrance, 300 steps cut directly into the rock face. The steps are narrow, the drop beside them is significant. By the time you reach the entrance, you have understood, physically rather than intellectually, why this place exists outside ordinary categories of human experience. Inside, 8 monks currently live in rooms carved into the cliff itself, spaces of stone and shadow where the temperature, the silence, and the light are determined by the mountain rather than by the monks. The monastery is cool regardless of the season. The rock regulates it, as it has for 1,000 years. Visitors are received with hospitality, sweet wine, fried dough with honey, brought out by whichever monk is on duty that day. What Meteora, Ostrog, and Panagia Hosovoyotissa have in common is not merely architectural audacity. It is a specific relationship to height, the conviction that elevation is not metaphorical but literal, that to be closer to the sky is to be in a different relationship to whatever it is you are seeking. The geography is the theology, the climb is the practice, and there is a practical dimension that should not be overlooked. These monasteries were built in impossible places, partly because impossible places are difficult to reach, and difficult to reach means difficult to attack. In a region that has spent centuries as the intersection of competing empires, building somewhere that armies cannot easily follow was not mysticism. It was survival strategy. The spiritual and the strategic were the same decision. But there are places in the Balkans where you don't need to climb a cliff to escape time, because time came down and decided to live beside them, and they learned to have coffee with it.
In the year 2093 AD, the Roman Emperor Diocletian began construction of a retirement palace on the Dalmatian coast, in what is now the Croatian city of Split. He spent 11 years building it. The palace covered roughly 30,000 square meters, a complex of apartments, temples, a mausoleum, baths, and fortified walls that made it as much a small city as a private residence. Diocletian retired there in 305 AD. One of the very few Roman emperors who voluntarily resigned from power and spent his remaining years growing cabbages, as he famously described his retirement to those who tried to persuade him to return to politics. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, the population of the nearby Roman city of Salona faced chaos. They moved into the palace. They did not ask permission from an authority that no longer existed. They adapted what had been designed for one emperor to serve several thousand ordinary people. 1,700 years later, approximately 3,000 people still live inside those walls. The number has barely changed in centuries. The walls set a physical limit. What has changed is everything else. There are now restaurants inside the imperial reception halls, bars in the basement where Diocletian's guards once slept, a jazz club in the vaulted cellars, a cafe in the emperor's mausoleum, which was converted to a cathedral in the 7th century and is still an active place of worship. The experience of walking through Diocletian's palace is genuinely disorienting in the most productive possible way. You enter through a gate that is 1,700 years old, and you step into a city, not a reconstruction, not a living history exhibit. A city, with people going about their morning, with laundry on lines strung between ancient columns, with the smell of coffee coming from behind a Roman arch, with children being called home for dinner across a courtyard that has seen 17 centuries of the same. The archaeologist Sheila McNally, who spent years studying Split, observed that Diocletian's palace presents a challenge to every standard archaeological framework, because the site has never been abandoned. There is no before and after, no clear moment of desertion and rediscovery. It has been continuously inhabited for 17 centuries. The continuity of habitation is itself the most important historical fact about it. In most of the world, when we find something very old, we protect it by creating distance, a rope, a ticket barrier, a glass case. We make it inaccessible to preserve it from the damage that contact causes.
In Split, the opposite experiment has been running for 17 centuries. What happens when the ancient thing is never made inaccessible? What happens when people simply continue to live inside it, generation after generation? The answer, in Split, is that it survives. The old bridge of Mostar, Stari Most, was completed in 1566, under the Ottoman Empire. The architect was Mimar Hayruddin, a student of the great Ottoman architect Sinan. The bridge took 9 years to build. It spans the Neretva River in a single arch of pale limestone, a stone called Tenelija, quarried from the surrounding hills, and for 4.5 centuries, it connected the eastern and western banks of the city, and the two communities on either side of it. There is a tradition in Mostar as old as the bridge itself. Young men dive from the crown of the arch into the Neretva below. The drop is approximately 21 meters. The river is cold even in summer. The tradition has its own brotherhood, the Mostar divers, with a formal initiation passed down for centuries. You earn the right to dive by completing a training program, transmitted from generation to generation. On the 9th of November, 1993, Croatian military forces shelled Stari Most with an artillery piece positioned on the surrounding hills. The shelling lasted approximately 9 seconds. The bridge that had stood for 427 years came down into the Neretva. The fall was filmed. The footage has been shown many times, and it retains its power to produce a particular kind of grief. The grief not of personal loss, but of witnessing the destruction of something that seemed impossible to destroy. In the aftermath, local divers and engineers began doing something that had not been officially organized. They went into the Neretva and retrieved the stones, the original Tenelija limestone blocks. Hundreds of them were pulled from the riverbed and catalogued. The intention, stated before the war had even ended, was to rebuild. Engineers made a deliberate decision. The bridge would be rebuilt using traditional methods, the original Tenelija stone, including the recovered blocks, the same mortar technique from the 16th century, which involved mixing egg whites into the binding material. No concrete, no modern adhesives. The bridge would be, as closely as possible, the same bridge, not a replica, a restoration. The reconstruction took nearly a decade. In 1998, the World Bank, UNESCO, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, and the governments of Croatia, the Netherlands and Turkey all contributed to the project. The bridge reopened on the 23rd of July 2004. At the ceremony, a banner was stretched across the arch that read, "Don't forget, don't repeat." And then the Mostar divers climbed to the top of the rebuilt arch and jumped, as they had always jumped, as though the bridge had never fallen. There is something in the decision to use egg whites, not modern adhesive, that repays careful thought. The engineers were not being romantic. Egg whites were used in traditional Ottoman mortar because they strengthen limestone bonding. The decision was technically informed, but it was also a statement about what kind of thing the rebuilt bridge should be. Not a monument to Stari Most, not a replica of it. Stari Most itself, continuous, unbroken in its identity, with an 11-year interruption that is now part of its history. The way a scar is part of a face, not instead of it. In Plovdiv, Bulgaria, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Europe, the Romans built a theatre in the 2nd century AD, during the reign of Trajan. They carved it into the slope of one of the city's hills, giving the seating the sensation of sitting inside the earth, rather than on top of a human construction. In 1972, a landslide exposed part of the buried structure. The city excavated it, restored it, and then, rather than rope it off, opened it for performances. Every summer, the Plovdiv Ancient Theatre hosts concerts, opera, and theatre productions. The audience sits on 2,000-year-old Roman stone under an open sky, watching performances that the citizens of Roman Philippopolis would have recognized. The structure built for this purpose is still being used for this purpose. The difference between Plovdiv and a preserved Roman theatre in Rome is not a difference of resources or respect, it is a difference of philosophy. In the Balkans, preservation means continued use. The theatre has survived because it was never stopped. And then there is perhaps the most Balkan example of all. In Trebinje, Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is a bridge called the Arslan-Agić Bridge, built in 1574 under the Ottoman Empire. For 4 centuries it spanned the Trebisnica River at a specific location on the edge of town. In the 1960s, a hydroelectric dam project required the flooding of the area where the bridge stood. The decision that was made is one of the most literal expressions of Balkan historical thinking that exists. The engineers dismantled the bridge stone by stone, numbered every block, catalogued every piece, transported the entire structure 2 kilometers away, and reassembled it exactly as it had been. Same stones, same arch, different place. In most of the world, when an old structure stands in the way of progress, the choice is binary: preserve it in place and work around it, or accept the loss. Trebinger found a third option that seems to occur naturally only to people who have been carrying their history long enough that carrying it is simply what you do. History here is not archived, it is not fenced off. In the Balkans, history is transported, moved with the same care you would give to anything you intend to keep using. The world asks, how do we protect this? The Balkans asks, where does this need to go? 3 acts, 3 answers, and now the question I asked you at the very beginning.
We began in a place where the history of atrocity and the history of beauty share the same physical walls, where a question that has no comfortable answer, who has the right to declare a wound healed, sits inside a stone fortress beside an infinity pool, and nobody pretends that tension isn't there, where a leper colony built its own newspaper and its own schools in defiance of a world that had already written off everyone inside it, where a city keeps its bullet holes not because it cannot move on, but because it chose to remember the difference between not being able to forget and choosing to. We went up into the cliffs, to the places where human beings, at moments of maximum external threat, looked at an impassable rock face and chose it as home, and built there, in places that are both architecturally impossible and logistically deliberate, communities of extraordinary faith and exceptional practical intelligence, where a rope hangs from a monastery on a 400-meter pillar, and a monk answers a question about when it gets changed with 6 words that contain a complete theology, and we walk through the streets of a city that is also a 1,700-year-old Roman palace, where 3,000 people live inside the emperor's walls, and nobody considers this remarkable. We stood on a bridge that was destroyed in 9 seconds after 427 years, and rebuilt by divers who went into a river to retrieve the original stones because no other stone would do. We sat in a theater 2,000 years old that still holds concerts every summer under an open sky, and we saw a bridge that was dismantled stone by stone and carried to a new location rather than abandoned, because in the Balkans you don't leave your history behind, you bring it with you. What happens to a people who cannot or will not escape their history? They become it. The Ottomans are gone, the Romans are gone, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, every structure that claimed this land, that built on it, that tried to define it and sometimes to destroy it, gone. And yet the bridge stands, the palace is inhabited, the monasteries hold their morning services, the theater puts on its summer concerts. The stones of the moved bridge still bear weight in their new location. The bullet holes are still there, exactly as left, filled with the decision not to pretend, and they remain, not despite their history, but because of it. Every empire that tried to erase them added another layer to what they are. Every wound meant to break them became a scar they chose to keep. Every bridge that fell into the river became an occasion to remember exactly how it was built. The Balkans is not a region that has survived history. It is a region that has been made by it, stone by stone, wound by wound, century by century, into something that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. If this journey meant something to you, leave one word in the comments. Just one word. Whatever the Balkans makes you feel right now, in this moment. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs a journey like this one, someone who needs to be reminded that beauty and brutality are not opposites, that wounds can become faces, and that the things worth keeping are worth carrying, share this with them.